sure. So my name is Jackson. I'm an editor at FSG, which is a book publisher under Macmillan. There's like 5 big book publishers in general that control a lot of the market. And Macmillan is one of them. And so we're our own small group within that bigger group. And my job, it's kind of what you think, and it's also not what you think. I do a lot of reading, like endless reading. That's what I will be doing after this and what I was doing before this. And I do a lot of editing, which means, working with my writers to basically make their writing better. For fiction, that means everything from pacing to their characters, to the language. For nonfiction, more organization, tracing arguments, also working with language. I don't do like grammar or copy editing. That's a different part of our industry, although we work really closely with production editors and copy editors. But my job is more kind of like project manager of a book. So an editor is involved in every aspect of a book, which is something I didn't know when I started. The first thing, I guess at the very beginning, what we do is I am in charge of actually negotiating and acquiring books. So the 2 main parts of a business transaction in book publishing are an editorial, like a kind of editor publishing house, and an agency. And what book agents do is they find writers, whether through college programs or reading them online or all kinds of places. And they then kind of assemble a project with that writer and then send it out to editors like myself, who have interests in the subjects that the person's writing about. So if I love something, I will then ask my bosses for some money to buy it, and I usually have to make a pretty strong case. I did not know that this job was going to have a lot of economics involved in it. I was an English major and really cannot do math, and so I've had to learn a lot about that. But one part of our job is considering how a new project will fit into the landscape. And I can talk about how that process works and my issues with it. But once I get approved for money, I have to negotiate with the agent, and hopefully the writer wants to sign with me. After I do that, I have to work on the contract, and then I do my editing. I plan my seasons and lists way out in advance. So right now I'm editing books that are going to come out in 2023 and 2024, which is kind of overwhelming to keep in my head at once. And after I'm done editing, the book goes to copy editors and fact checkers and proofreaders. At the same time, I will collaborate with our art department on the cover, and I'll collaborate with the author and hear what they want to have on the cover. As I said, project manager is basically what I do. I'm with the author every step of the way. Authors need a lot of hand-holding, like a lot of artists do. So my job is kind of therapist also. I take a lot of late night phone calls. And then once we have copies of the book, I work with the publicist to kind of figure out how to market this book, whose hands to get it in. I do a lot of kind of outreach on the side with my own social media platforms, because a lot of the books I publish are by non-white writers or non-straight writers, non-cis writers, and a lot of those readers aren't maybe getting reached by the kind of typical corporate outreach. And so that's something I have made a kind of cornerstone of my career and of I don't know, the stuff I care about. And then the book is in the world, and so I'm helping the author promote themselves, schedule events along with the publicist, working with them through the paperback. So it's really an investment of several years, honestly, when I invest in an author. Of course, that can be different for children's books and cookbooks. I'm only speaking for literary fiction and nonfiction. So my day in general, a lot of reading, a lot of corresponding with agents, editing, meetings with publicity people on my books, with the art department on my books, putting out a lot of fires is basically it's kind of how we all describe our jobs. I hope that's okay. I know it's a lot of information, but that's what it is.
Oh, that was wonderful. Thank you for being a You
So I
all
hope I'm
didn't
not
have to
I hope I'm not
come.
boring. I'm sorry.
I mean, any literary firefighter is wonderful. I have a question, but before I talk, does anyone else have a question you would like to ask Jackson? If not, I will. Antoine over here.
When you're out, when you're looking at books or for books to invest in, what are some things that you look for that, you know, that says, oh, this is the one, or this is what I'm going to go for?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's probably the hardest part of my job because like everybody's taste is subjective, right? So there's stuff that I get in. I have passed on books that have gone on to sell a bunch of copies and win awards. It's just kind of how it goes. It's all about personal taste. The main thing I think about first and foremost is the company I'm working at. So FSG is pretty literary. We publish, we like to really publish writers of the highest literary quality. So I look for the voice, and if I think it can kind of fit in with us. But then, the main thing I think about is like, who would I give this book to? Like, if I have a feeling in my gut when I read something, if I love the voice and I read something and I'm like, oh my God, this reviewer, or even this friend of mine, or I could see this cover for this book. If I have a vision of how to publish something, that's what gets me excited. So it's really the voice. I can always work with somebody on their plot or grammar or whatever, but if there's a voice and imagination that, that's the stuff you can't really teach. And so I have to take a risk. And that's what's really scary about my job, is that I'm kind of playing with money that isn't mine, obviously. And I have to take a risk on somebody's writing just based on if I love it. So yeah, I guess I look for the voice. I look for how it could compete in the market in general. But the caveat I'll add to that is that thinking about the market only takes you so far. And I have many books that don't have comparisons in the market, mostly because they're from marginalized writers or because they're more experimental. And that's something I think about too, is about, if everybody's telling me no, not to buy something, are they telling me because it doesn't look like something that they're comfortable with, or is it simply because they don't like it? So I get reads from my coworkers, but ultimately the decision is mine. And it's kind of corny to say, but I just go with my gut.
Please, could you give an example of related stories you interested in?
Matt, would you mind repeating that for me? I just couldn't hear the full thing.
Rose, correct me if I'm wrong. The question was, could you talk about voice and what?
Example.
Yeah, like
Voice.
I love that you asked that. I had the same question. I wanted to ask if you could talk about the authors you've worked with and what qualities about the voice excites you and makes you want to give their work to other people, which I think is such a beautiful benchmark of a great story.
Yeah, I mean, again, this is just, I can't even emphasize how much this is just for me, obviously, because there's no universal standard, thankfully, for what should be published or not. But I have one author, Brontez Purnell, Black queer author from Alabama. He lives in Oakland now. And I read a book of his that he published on an indie press. And within 2 pages, I mean, I was laughing my ass off. And I mean, it was so funny. But then a paragraph later, he hits you with something so casually devastating. And I was just kind of struck by how within 1 paragraph, he was able to blend kind of the hilarious and totally painful. In that case, I had never really read somebody who operated on such extremes. And I just knew I had to talk to this person and try to get to know him. So I guess in terms of voice, if I can generalize, which is hard, but confidence, feeling distinct, not trying to simply mimic another writer, but actually basically just sounding like yourself. I'm really an advocate of kind of doubling down on who you are. I think when I started out, I was trying to acquire books and like placate the market and different types of readers. And then once I decided just to kind of do what I want, I ended up finding the books that I love. So with voice, it's kind of the same thing. Polish can come later, but your unique perspective is singularly yours. And so that's what I look for. I mean, I really look for somebody who can tell a story in the way that only they can tell it. And a writer, I think, who really does that is like Junot Diaz, for example. When Drown came out, a lot of people, he was writing in a mix of Spanish and English, and he was cursing, and the grammar was all over the place. I mean, it was something that a quote unquote traditional audience wasn't supposed to understand, and yet there was something so universal about it and so uncompromising. And so that's kind of what I look for. I look for originality, I look for confidence, and I look for that type of perspective that nobody else can give me besides that writer. Does that make sense? I hope that's okay.
Yes, thank you. Any other questions? I have one in the waiting.
What advice would you give?
I'll repeat it.
What advice would you give to a person that's like, coming out of and that's looking to do what he does? What
Okay,
advice would you give yourself?
great question. So Jackson, did you hear that? If not,
Kind of, I think, could you repeat it?
I'll reiterate so everyone can
Yeah.
hear. What advice would you give for a young person, someone in this room, who wants to be an editor or is interested in getting into publishing editorial work in particular?
Yeah. I mean, that's the question I get all the time, and there's not one way. The way I always tell people to start is, look at your favorite books over the past couple of years, look on the spine, see who published that book, and look in the acknowledgments. And 9.5 times out of 10, the author will say, thanks to my editor and thanks to my agent. And what I really did in the beginning was I cold emailed a lot of editors. I get emails all the time from people trying to get into the game. And I always take time to have a phone call or a video chat. Most editors and most people in publishing in general know how difficult it is to get into this job. There aren't a lot of jobs, and a lot of people want them. And so I just did a lot of what we call informational interviews. And then when jobs come my way, which happens quite often, just kind of internally, I look at who I've talked to recently and I'll forward it to them. So unfortunately, it's a lot of kind of internal networking. And I think that's one of the big issues with publishing, is that it prioritizes a certain type of access that not everybody has. But you can look, I really tell everybody this, to look in the acknowledgments and see who's editing your favorite books. I've also noticed that, I feel like Twitter is actually a really good way to kind of see younger people in publishing and how they're getting started. I am pretty active there. I'm pretty candid about my experience and how I got into it. And that's also a good place to find people who are publishing work that you're interested in. And finally, everybody says this, but internships, they're paid luckily in publishing now. Not paid a lot, but they're not full-time. And with COVID, they're virtual, which is a huge improvement, I think, because it doesn't require you to live in Manhattan. You can do it from your house and get the same type of mentorship. So, and our interns are amazing. So it's kind of a lot of research, I would say, but apply widely to internships, look up editors and agents in the back of books. And the other thing about publishing that a lot of people don't know is there's so many sides of it that are not just editorial. We have publicity, for example, and sales, and all those departments. You still have to be a really good reader, a really good writer, and you have an impact on how a book is published. And so I do kind of have like the job that you would think a book editor is. I get to read books all day for a fancy publishing house, but I have friends who started trying to be editors and ended up working in cookbooks or ended up being marketing people. And it's the same type of, I think, creative and intellectual stimulation. So honestly, talking to as many people as possible, just sending emails out to people by saying, hey, I'm so-and-so and I'm looking to learn more about publishing, most people will have been in your shoes and they'll want to help. And it can be a real pain, but it's really worth learning about, because this industry is incredibly bad about being transparent. And so that's why I'm here, hopefully helping you guys learn something about it, and to talk to whoever, because there's not a lot of info out there. So just ask everybody, and hopefully they will respond to you. I bet they will, because we've all been in that position.
May I jump in with a question, Matt? Jane here.
Hi, Jane.
Hi, Professor Cleland. Take it away.
Hello. My question is for Mr. Howard, whether you accept unsolicited manuscripts, or do you only accept manuscripts that come to you from agents?
It's a great question. I mean, it's my official position is that I do not accept unsolicited manuscripts, just because my inbox as it is with agented submissions is out of control. University presses, indie presses, those presses always accept unsolicited submissions, and many of them have prizes, competitions, moments to submit, a manuscript for consideration. I do get unsolicited submissions, and I will say the ones that I actually take seriously, I guess, are from writers who actually know the books that I work on. And, maybe it's not for me, but it's a writer who is really interested in queer stories, or is interested in the type of nonfiction I do. And if it seems that what they're doing lines up with the type of books I publish, I will always try to look at it. But like on my website, I have to say, like, I can't take every submission, because I can't. But if it feels totally specifically tailored to me, I will look at it. But again, places like, I don't know, Grey Wolf or the Feminist Press, or pretty much every university press that does fiction, like West Virginia University Press and stuff, I know they take unsolicited submissions, and it's honestly how a lot of writers get started.
And may I just say for the students here that if you are fortunate enough to get an offer, it is then very easy to get an agent, and you should
Correct.
do so.
Yes, and
Don't
I will
negotiate your own
yes.
deal.
Do not negotiate your own deal. And to that point, there are several writers of mine who I have found, so you could say, and then introduce them to an agent to set them up with, and we do the deal together, because A, it's to have somebody else in your corner and an advocate, and B, I just don't want anybody to feel taken advantage of. And so by no means do I only find writers through agents. I do my own research. I have friends send me things. I go to conferences, I talk to classes, and I do meet people that way. So there's not just one way to get published, but I think that's mainly the way to get published. Yeah.
Yes. Okay, so Yvette has a question. Yvette, I love your vest, by the way. So Yvette has a question, then I have a question, and then I think we have time probably for 2 more. So you can think about anything you'd like to ask. But Yvette, after you.
So, Mr. Jackson, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, so my question is this: as an editor, taking on someone's work, you mentioned earlier that you kind of babysit the authors.
Yeah.
So when you're editing the work, do you actually? You also mentioned their books. Do you actually edit and then send it back to them to hear if they approve it, or can you go ahead and edit the work and then just send the complete work to the author?
That's a great question.
With you when you're editing the work.
That's a good question. No, I mean, my answer is editing is totally collaborative. My job is to serve an author. I mean, I actually look at my job as in a way like a service job. It is to help an author make their project the best it can be. So I will, every time I send an author edits, I always preface by saying, these are suggestions. I do think that things need to be like this, but these are just suggestions. And my job is never to, kind of like force myself onto a project. I think writing is something that's incredibly personal and incredibly important to protect and delicate. And I, by no means, would ever kind of overrun an author's vision. I think I like to challenge my authors, but I think that's very different than kind of just putting my agenda, especially when it comes to editing authors who, you know, aren't white or aren't cis or female authors. Like I'm very aware of my own limitations in terms of my perspective. And so the best editorial projects that I work on are very kind of lively collaborations. And, you know, if I wanted to completely control something, I would probably just write my own book, which I have no intention on doing. So I hope that answers the question.
Thank you.
Great question. So my question was about, let the record show.
Oh yeah.
You edited. I would just like to know more about the process of working with a specific author. We read chapter 1, Mechanisms of Power, ACT UP in Puerto Rico. So could you just give us a sense of what it's like to work with an editor, maybe that specific chapter?
Yeah, well, man, as you guys can see, that book is enormous and it almost took me down. That thing is, I use it even as like a yoga block sometimes here because you could hit somebody with it and cause serious damage. So that book was daunting, but it's an incredibly important book to me, and I think to society. You know, broadly, it really reframes AIDS activism as not just the domain of cis white men, but actually this amazing coalition of people of all races, sexualities, gender identities, who formed this unlikely coalition to basically change millions of people's lives. And it's a remarkable story. The concern of Sarah Schulman, who is an amazing writer and activist. She's also a professor at CUNY Staten Island, a lifelong New Yorker. And what she really wanted to accomplish was to broaden the record, basically. You know, traditionally what's been known about AIDS is that many gay white men died and it was gay white men who saved them. And that's just not true. And gay white men were disproportionately affected by AIDS. But there were also women with HIV, and ACT UP had to fight to change the CDC definition to include them. There were drug users who, because they were sharing needles, contracted HIV, and they became part of the coalition. And that was, you know, something that she and I talked about in terms of how to organize that book, because as you'll see, that book doesn't move chronologically. It's actually a kind of analysis of how ACT UP got things done, because another aspect of that book is to teach activists and organizers today how to achieve what ACT UP achieved. And so it was really important for Sarah to organize her book kind of along the lines of ideology and practice and stuff like that, instead of just an ABC of what happened, because we have a lot of that. But what we don't have are these in-depth looks into activist movements. And something Sarah says, I just saw her speak last week, is that, you know, there are activist movements like ACT UP happening all over the world on micro levels that we don't even know about, that don't get attention because they're working just locally. And so this book could be a primer for people. So that was kind of just our thinking going into this book. Sarah, specifically that chapter and the way the book is organized, the book is based on oral history. And oral history can be an amazing resource. It can also be really boring to read if you don't do it right. Nobody really wants to read 700 pages of people just talking. And so the first draft actually was 700 pages of people just talking. And I had to talk to Sarah and say, you know, we have one shot to publish this book. Let's put it in your words. You have to actually tell a story. And so she went back to the drawing board, took those oral histories, and kind of formed them into a narrative. And so it was actually really important to start with the ACT UP Puerto Rico chapter, because it was a surprising choice. It's not, it's not who you think about when you think of ACT UP or when you think about AIDS activism. And that's what I love about it. Latinos were a huge part of the coalition and were disproportionately impacted by HIV then and now. And I think it was really important to show that, these links, these kind of intersectional, unexpected links between Puerto Rico and New York and across the diaspora, but also through people who had no connection to Puerto Rico and still wanted to get involved. And so the point of that chapter, I think, was to also illuminate the different ways that AIDS impacts people. Like I said, whether it's local organizing or drug use or family planning. I mean, it's not just associated with gay men in the 80s. And so I love that chapter because it's a character study. It conveys kind of essential information about how the organization worked. And yeah, I guess that's it. But that was Sarah's. That was all Sarah who wanted to do that. And the book actually ends with another Latino organizer, which was also her idea. So I love that chapter. I love that it starts off the book like that. I also think the introduction, I don't know if you read that, Matt, but what comes before that chapter is remarkable, and it kind of gives an overview of the book. So she and I worked really hard to make the book readable in terms of its organization, while also kind of staying true to her master plan. But yeah, that book's a special case. It required me to be really creative.
Any comments from the class or questions? Yes, Celine and Antoine?
Well, if you want to comment on that, you can go first.
I was commenting that it was very, very easy to read. Like, it's a lot of information, but the way it was written,
Yeah.
it was easy to read because it was like a story almost. And it shined light on people that I didn't even know about. When I do think of ACT UP, I do think of white male figures.
Right.
People that are within that, and then those conflicts even within the organization with all the subcommittees was very, very interesting.
Yeah, and that second aspect of the book, serving like a manual for activists, was really compelling.
Yeah, I mean, what just to respond to that, I mean, what was so remarkable, what I learned about ACT UP is that, most movements, when you try to get everybody on the exact same page, they fail. And what was amazing about ACT UP is they had one shared goal, which was to stop HIV/AIDS, but they kind of had like everybody was doing different stuff at the same time, and they didn't all have to agree. And like you were saying, they were fighting with each other. People got kicked out. People came back in. I mean, it was total chaos, but they all had the same goal. And the reason I think that they actually won so many protections for marginalized people is because they had so many different types of people organizing. And as Sarah says, people make change, or they create action from their own point of view. And so there were a group of white men who were kind of using that position to meet with Fauci or, the big kind of government people. But then you had folks who grew up in New York and who were in those communities, and they were just kind of trying to change things on a local level. And so I like that chapter, and I like the book in general because it shows things don't have to be a top-down structure. And I think that's where a lot of kind of progressive movements today get bogged down. There's like a bureaucratic kind of situation involved. And whereas with ACT UP, they were so desperate that everybody was just kind of doing everything at once. And in that chaos, they actually created so much change.
Celine?
Yes, hello. I guess I wanted to ask, what is an experience you had that made you proud of your job, and how did you have the support to keep going?
Did you say that made me proud of my job?
Yeah, what is an experience you had
Yeah.
that made you proud of your job, and how did you have the support to keep going?
Great question. I can think of two things instantly come to mind. So the first book I ever acquired is called Tears of the Truffle Pig, and by a writer named Fernando Flores. As you can tell by the title, it is totally bonkers. And Fernando, he's a first-gen American, and he grew up in Mexico, came over to Texas, worked a series of odd jobs. I mean, like everything from audio-visual installation to barista while working on fiction. He didn't even have a computer. And this man is like out of one of his stories. He's like 6'4" and wears all black and has like huge feet that he only wears like these big dress shoes in. He's like out of a movie. And even now he lives in a converted stable in Austin, Texas. That's furnished and looks like a house, but it literally used to be a horse stable. But you know, he's an unlikely writer, but he really kept at it. And finally he got access. He wrote all these books on a typewriter. I mean, it's kind of crazy. And he typed everything up on a computer and queried agents. And what that means is he literally, did research and cold emailed tons of agents with a pitch about his novel. And only one agent responded to him and asked to see more and signed him. And so after they worked on the book, that agent sent it out. And at the time I was 23, I was a year and a half into my job as an assistant for an editor. And, when you ask about the support I got, simply I have a remarkable mentor who continues to support me. And the main thing about him that I love is that he does not need to fully understand something to still support me. And I find that to be incredibly rare, not only in publishing, but just everywhere. Like he's a straight white guy. And if something's too queer or too out of his lane, he gets excited by it. So this book came into him and he asked if I would read it, and I read it. And the book is kind of like sci-fi-y. It's like speculative, and it's set on the border, and it's kind of psychedelic, and it's an adventure, and I just loved it. And I had a vision for it, and he told me to go for it. And what makes me so proud about that book is not only is it just great, but it created an entire career for Fernando. So he went from being a bookseller at an indie bookstore, which he still works at, but he was giving interviews everywhere. He was reviewed in the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal and nominated for awards. And the book was even optioned for TV and film, which got Fernando a nice check. That hasn't come out yet or anything, but his entire life changed, and it got translated into Spanish and French. He got to travel to Europe for the first time. He left Texas really for the first time. And so seeing that happen for somebody who worked so hard and who didn't go to an MFA program and who dropped out of college, but stayed true to his craft. I mean, for that to be the first author that I worked with just means the world. And we're still really close, and I signed up 2 more of his books, and we have his short stories coming in May. And he went from knowing nobody to having tons of press and tons of other authors support him. And similarly, the author I was mentioning, Brontez Purnell, who wrote this book 100 Boyfriends, which is not for the faint of heart, but if you're into crazy queer fiction, I can't recommend it more. It's really sexy and wild, and it's R-rated in a lot of ways. And again, that's somebody who did not have a really big kind of literary platform. He was a performance artist and a filmmaker, and he had been a go-go dancer, a rock star. He's had this insane life. And to publish somebody like him, who is radically, uncompromisingly queer and Black and HIV positive, to publish somebody like him underneath the logo of FSG, this really fancy publishing house, was so inherently transgressive. But then seeing the book kind of explode and sell tons of copies, and then seeing him in the New York Times daily paper, I got really emotional. So what's awesome about my job, especially at the house I work at, is that even if a book sells not a lot of copies, it's quietly changing the culture, and it's also just giving a writer a platform, and that to me is what's most exciting. So people often ask, like, if it's like why editors aren't on the front cover or even in the copyright, and like why our job is behind the scenes. And I don't do it for credit. I do it to kind of, nothing makes me happy than seeing somebody kind of get what they're due. So yeah, that's why, I guess that's what I'm proud of.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm fine on time, Matt. So
Oh, you're good.
we're fine. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Or I should be looking over here. Oh, fabulous. Could you remind me of your name? Sharika. I haven't seen you in person. It's so nice to see you. We're outside of Zoom land, kind of. So Jackson, Sharika over here.
Hey.
My name is Sharika. So your statement just now answered my question. But I'm still gonna ask it. So was there ever a time as an author you felt nervous or funny publishing someone's words, or you told them that's so scale back, don't expose this much? Was there ever a time you felt that in your career?
Matt, I heard, like, is there times you felt nervous about, and then I think I got some of it, but would you just repeat it for me? Matt, or just because you're far back, yeah.
I'll repeat it. Yeah. Well, could you repeat it? Sorry.
Or come forward. It's just the distance.
So the nice thing about being back in person is we have neighbors, and one of our neighbors, I don't know if you saw, came in and asked us to like be quiet. Whatever. So I'm sorry, I was turning down the volume, and Sharika, I couldn't hear your question. Could you repeat it?
Yes. So Mr. Jackson, I was asking, your statement, your last few words told me that you weren't afraid. But I still want to ask you, was there ever a time in your career as an author you felt like you had to tell your, as an editor, you had to tell the author, he or she should scale back, not disclose much,
Okay.
for his or her career, destroy family, or
Right.
Yeah. So did you?
Okay. Yeah. No, I
How
think
do you
I
have those
think I
tough
hear you.
conversations?
Yeah. So I mean, there's two situations, I guess, in this question. The first is that, for the most part, the answer is a hard no. I think a lot of us are, I don't know, kind of restricted by like respectability politics. I do not try and please, the people who who pay me. Like, I'm not scared to make them feel uncomfortable. I actually think that's my job. Granted, I have the privilege of saying that because I have this stable job, and I know they're not going to fire me for publishing something that's a little too quote unquote out there. I don't manage what my authors do in their private lives. If anything, the fact that they aren't buttoned up or quote unquote traditional is what I love about them. Now, there are times when, I would like an author to think a little bit before doing something in terms of how they're going to be perceived by the public, because, a book brings a lot more attention, and just certain things about what we're talking about, like in an event or when we bring the bosses in a publicity meeting, what to expect. But I would feel really, really uncomfortable trying to police or corral one of my authors. I will say, in terms of the content of books, it's up to authors what they want to do. So I have a book coming out this fall called "If I Survive You" by a Jamaican American writer named Jonathan Escoffery. And
All right, Jackson, could you repeat that? It just skipped a little bit.
Yeah. So I have this, I will say about tough conversations in terms of the content of books. The only time I go there is, when the author wants me to have that tough conversation. So in the case of this book, If I Survive You, he's a Jamaican-American author named Jonathan Escoffrey. He's from Miami. And the book's out in September. It's amazing. And that book is based on his life in a lot of ways. And there are characters based on his family, on his parents and on his siblings. And, you know, he and I had to have a real conversation about what he'd be comfortable with and how he's going to go about those conversations with his family. And I think he's still working on it, frankly. I think his relationship with some members of his family has been a little bit strained by the book, but never did I force him, you know, to include anything that he didn't want to put in that book. That is something I would never do. I guess the one other thing I will say, sometimes on social media, sometimes on social media, authors do a little too much, and I will once in a while say, like, you don't have to post that, but it's never something about their personal lives. It's just, you know, if it's their own anxiety manifesting. And I know, I'm sorry, I've just been talking about this, but one story I do have, and I feel fine sharing it because it's not my author, but we published, another editor at my company published Talib Kweli's memoir, the rapper Talib Kweli, who I love. And the memoir is really, really good. At the time, though, on Twitter, he like got in this huge, I don't know if any of you remember this, but he got in this huge Twitter spat with an activist, and he was taking something really personally. And he basically was so, he was more or less harassing her to the point that Twitter kicked him off the platform. And it totally messed up the book publication. And you know, it was to the point that we didn't even really want to promote the book because his behavior was frankly embarrassing. And so, you know, he's obviously fine. He has his career, the book's out there, but that's the type of situation where I think if it was a non-celebrity author, we would have intervened pretty fast and had a moment for them to kind of reconsider how they were engaging. But besides that, no, I'm never going to tell my authors how to act or how to write. I think that would be going against what I care about. So.
I had a question about intersectionality. We've been talking about that today. And you have worked with some editors, including Judith Butler, Sarah Schulman, people who have a lot to say about intersectionality. And I'm curious, the authors you have worked with, how have they changed your definition of intersectionality or your understanding of that word?
Yeah, on a literal level, in terms of just the actual meaning of that word, I can't really have an answer. However, I will say, I guess I see, you know, working with writers who are not like me, whether that's Sarah, who's, you know, a lesbian in her 60s, or Judith, or any of my authors, the main thing that how I see intersectionality within publishing, at least it begins in who we are thinking our readers are, right? So for a long time, there's this notion of like the traditional reader, which is a coded way of saying like middle-aged white women in book clubs and older white guys who read, you know, history books about war. Nobody's thinking, I guess, about, you know, when I have a gay book that I publish, everybody's thinking just to get it to gay people. But that's such a reductive and, you know, not intersectional way of thinking about who our readership is. And so, you know, it's still a business, my job, and my job is to sell books. And when I was first starting our sales department, it felt like they had such a limited understanding of who a readership could be just based on a singular identity. So we had a book by a Black author. Obviously, we were targeting Black publications and booksellers, but that's so, you know, very quickly you realize that that's not how these things work. There are Black booksellers who actually read a lot of sci-fi and don't want to read just memoirs from Black writers. There are straight friends of mine who love queer literature. And that was something that, you know, I've had to work really hard with my coworkers and the higher ups to kind of understand. But what I've learned in that process, you know, I found myself guilty of the same type of kind of assumptions. When I pitched books, I think, oh, this person has a built-in audience. But often we don't think about the different audiences just within that audience. And so when I send to booksellers, for example, it's not that if I have a Black writer, I only send to Black booksellers. Rather, I look at who's liking short stories that I'm publishing, or who's liking sci-fi, and going, seeing people as kind of three-dimensional beings instead of just emblematic of one or two identities. And so, going back to Sarah, that's what made ACT UP so amazing, was that it was this kind of intersectional coalition. It wasn't just delineated on one identity. And I think, for book publishing to stay relevant, which is obviously on all of our minds, it's a matter of taking people at their most complex and at all the ways they are, and not just based on like what slice of the market they fill. Because the books of mine that have worked the most are the ones that initially my higher ups thought were going to be the most niche and turned out to reach the most people. And I think that kind of sums up our world, and it's incredibly limiting to think about it just on a kind of case by, like on a one singular dimension. So in terms of my own relationship to that concept, I guess in like a kind of capitalistic way, that's how that formed. And honestly, just talking with my authors, asking them, who do you see reading your book? And the answers I get are always so surprising. So yeah, I hope that's an answer to that.
Thank you. Any other last questions or comments for Jackson? Yes, Pablo?
I just have a question, because I'm trying to become an author and I want to write a book. So say if I wrote a book about like a mythology, but I'm changing various things about the nature of that mythology, turning things around, making characters and connecting with other, well, not part of that mythology, things that relate to it in certain ways. Would that be an idea of something original, or would it be like a tired trope?
So you say, would it be you say a trope at the end? Is that what you said?
Yeah, tired trope.
Well, I think when it comes to what we call genre, for example, the rules are totally different. And by genre, I mean, presses that publish strictly sci-fi or strictly romance or strictly fantasy. Within genre presses, I actually don't think, I wouldn't say that trope is even something that's even used that much. For example, like the sci-fi, or I guess like speculative fantasy book that I love the most, which is was it the Tomi Adeyemi Children of Blood and Bone, which is amazing and I highly recommend. That book has all the kind of trappings of a traditional hero's arc. There's a child and she has magical powers and she has to fight against the bigger structures that don't want her to win. But it's the writing and the world building that really kind of made the book stand out. So I think working within just genre, it's all about the characters and the storytelling. And I actually think readers turn to genre books looking for those, I don't want to say tropes, but looking for those archetypes that can tell them a familiar story. You look at everything from Dune to Harry Potter to Star Wars, they follow very similar patterns, but it's the worlds that they inhabit that make it exciting. So I'm not the biggest genre reader. I try and read some fantasy stuff because I'm kind of a sci-fi nerd in that way, but I'm never kind of put off by something that feels familiar, as long as it feels exciting to me. Whereas when it comes to some like literature or literary fiction, I'm going to be much more strict in terms of looking for I don't know, a new idea or something like that.
Yeah, because when I write myself, I try to be as detailed as possible. I like to build a world before I do anything. So I like to have a character build up. I understand the world I want to create, and I understand the kind of genre I want it to be. The thing is, putting that from pen to paper is a very different object, because you want to get these characters right. You want to make them believable, but you also want to give them a sense of like an identity, something that while you can relate to them, you can also feel a sort of like reverence for them, but they're trying to be the same as you.
Right. Well, a lot of writers, fantasy or not, have what we call Bibles, right, that they have on the side. So you might have a 200-page novel that has a 50-page Bible, and that Bible is just basically what the author uses to write out this character's entire backstory, everything from their favorite foods to, you know, their favorite pair of shoes. And even if that doesn't make it into the book, I think it helps a lot of authors flush out who these characters are so that they can write them with more confidence. So yeah, I suggest you look into that, because having a Bible as as a fiction writer is kind of crucial if you're writing something really big and sweeping.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. Anyone online have a question they'd like to ask? I'm sorry, I can't really see who is online.
A few of us, it's like,
A few, okay. How about we wrap up with, is there, I feel so stupid asking this, but is there a question you wish we asked you?
that's a damn. Listen, I had a long day. Okay, you're trying to mess with my head, and make me answer something. No, you know, I the most obvious thing that I just tell everybody is to own what you like. I mean, that is the most important thing. Like when I started, I really was trying to conform, and then I started finding books that were outside the norm, but that made sense to me. And then suddenly those readers appeared. And so if there's nothing to be, I don't know, I have friends in their 30s who only read YA books and they love them. And that makes me really happy. So whatever you love reading and writing, that's exactly what you should be doing. I think it's important to challenge yourself, and the best writers and editors I know read like crazy. But what I don't do is I don't look on the New York Times bestseller list and think, oh, I need to read these top 3 books. I subscribe to newsletters. I follow people on Twitter. I see what books are being published, and then the ones that kind of catch my eye, I go to the library and check them out. And so I think taste, the one thing I talk about with a lot of people trying to get into this, is taste is something you can't buy, you can't define, but it's something that just comes from living and from reading. And so if you're just trying to kind of fit in with the rest of the industry, you're not going to develop your own taste. And so right now, for example, I'm reading a history book that won the National Book Award. That's kind of like a recovered history of one family's lineage during slavery. And I'm also reading a book in translation that's like a queer novel from Korea, and then a couple early books from friends that are more commercial. And then honestly, the last thing I'll say is last night I really wanted to read, but I was like, you know what, I actually want to watch Euphoria. And that's what I did instead. And honestly, that's what makes me, I think that helps me be a better editor. So following your gut in terms of what you're into is the number one thing that people do not do enough in my industry. And that's the main thing I like to preach to people. So
Thank you so much.
thanks for having me.
Can we all do the wave? Do we want to do that? No. Yeah,
It's just me in here, so
all right. Thank you so much, Jackson. This has been very insightful.
of course. Yeah, and Matt, if there's follow-up questions or whatever, you have my info, and happy to help. However, it's great you guys are meeting in person, still getting it done. It's exciting.
Yeah.
So,
all right. Thank you. Take care, everyone.
thanks, everyone. All right. Bye.
Be well.